pleased to introduce again Scott Tucker. He's going to continue in his Worldview series. And yes, that is literally Hitler on the screen. Let's give Scott a big round of applause. Come on, Scott.
I'm just coming.
Well, thank you for that rousing introduction. I do want to give credit where credit is due. This series started as a course based on this book called How Now Shall We Live, which is from Charles Colson. He died in 2012. You remember, if those of you who are my age will remember Chuck Colson is one of the Watergate plumbers, and he is all about redemption. You know, he spent the rest of his life being a fierce advocate for Christianity and for the Christian worldview. And so he wrote this book. It has a lot of great stuff in it. We're going to cover a little bit about it, but in the years since I got this book, I've tweaked it a lot, so you'll see a lot of Scott Tucker personality in this as well. Okay, so what's a redemption myth? You remember, Colson had introduced these three ideas. They call it the worldview grid. Every worldview basically has to answer three questions. Number one, where do we come from and who are we? Creation. Number two, what's wrong with the world and why? That's the fall. And number three, what can we do to fix it? That's redemption. And redemptions, everybody has a different way to fix what's wrong with the world. And thus they have a different redemption solution. And what I'd like to do is compare those with the Christian redemption solution, and then finally figure out, does Christianity really work? Is it the best answer? You've heard me say that the marketplace of ideas is a place where Christianity can compete with any other religion, philosophy, or worldview. And so the goal of this course is to try to show how that works. So we have a great human predicament. Colson said that sooner or later, even the most decent of us discover that we're rotten to the core. We wish for freedom from failure and from guilt for the things that we do wrong. And that longing has been present since the Garden of Eden. Every religion tries to address it. All of these different religions have different solutions to the predicament of what went wrong with the world. And you can see by studying religions sometimes where people might get their ideas for fixing the problem with humanity. But it's not limited to religion. Even non-religious philosophies try to address it. Escaping that fall is one of the greatest human needs. And the means of dealing with the fall, as we call it, is redemption. Solutions that don't recognize this reality are called redemption myths. And I use myths not in the sense of a story, but in a false belief. So really, the answer to your redemption comes with the reasons for your fall. Solutions to the world's problems are everywhere. There's as many solutions as there are worldviews that generate them. So let's start with one that Renee and I were just talking about this morning. What was interesting, we heard the news was talking about redistricting, and there was a discussion on whether this was racially discriminated or not, and that's how it's being presented to the court. And the alternative idea was, well, the Republicans weren't really interested in discriminating against race. They just wanted to make sure everything was Republican. And what can the government do to fix that? Because once upon a time, Texas was forced to have federal judicial review of all their political districts. And now they're not anymore because they met the standard of integration that was set at the time of that law. And so now, are we going back? You know, and I was just thinking, well, all these people are looking at it from the victim's standpoint. We also had a project in Houston that we're competing for, which is basically, you probably all heard about it, the U.S. Department of Transportation is trying to tear down the I-45 corridor that goes through Pierce Elevated. Right. Yep. And our idea is to turn that into an elevated park, like you see in New York City, with lots of trees and everything. And we've been chasing that for months. And the problem was they put a halt to that project because there were some victims there. There were some people that were going to get relocated. Well, how are you not victimized? And some of this got to the point where some of this, I think it's coming from somebody's worldview. Something must have happened that was bad because of something else, not because of me. If it weren't for X, we would be on the way to tall cotton, to being good. Everything's right in the world. If it wasn't for this. So the solution is to just get rid of that thing that interferes. And in fact, it's been, people have observed this for a long time. There was a book written a decade ago called A Nation of Victims by a guy named Charles Sykes, and he added up all the victims that felt like they were victimized in the minority. He said that makes up 374% of the population. And he said the United States has 70% of the world's supply of lawyers. Okay? So evidence is they must be keeping busy.
Naturalism, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, said that there was no God who created us, therefore there is no moral order that has been prescribed by God, therefore we can make up our own rules, therefore the object of life is to satisfy yourself and fulfill yourself. And that's why autonomy has been sold to the American people as the great holy grail. This is it. If we can just satisfy ourselves and do our own thing, and live for ourselves, we will be happy. In the 60s, the most pervasive movement, pervasive philosophy in America invaded our campuses. It came from French scholars, Camus and Sartre. It was called existentialism. And it was that God is dead, so you overcome the nothingness. There is no purpose to life. You overcome that void, that vacuum, that nothingness of life by your own heroic individualism. So you go out and you have free sex and cheap drugs and have your big parties and tie-dye shirt.
Okay, that's Chuck Colson. Obviously a child of the 60s. And that was the belief at the time, that there were things you could do individually to free yourself from oppression, and that I'm just going to be me. I'm going to do whatever I want. There's no ultimate authority. Right and wrong is what I decide. It's sort of, and that's the idea of this existentialist worldview. And that led to lots of these sexual crusaders, as he will mention. I used to have a video, by the way, that goes with this, but I'm not going to go with it anymore. They did some things and it was tasteful, but yeah, they did some things at Woodstock, for example, that everybody felt like, you know, this was the most beautiful, peaceful thing in the world. Everybody did what they wanted. And at the time, there was a big longing to restore that. So they had Woodstock, 1999, I believe it was. 68. Well, 68 was the first one. They had another one where they tried to recreate that one, where all these old gray hair people went to Woodstock again. But it turned into much less. It was... Yeah, it is. Right, right. Right, and that happened in 1968 too. But the point was, is it wasn't the environment or the external that freed all these people into this new age nirvana. It was, and there was still those problems. You know, both of them had the problem of not planning in restrooms and drugs and violence. And as we've seen recently, you know, a concert that's intended to make everybody happy can also turn into a disaster for external events as well, no matter how hard you try. So was the cause of, say, the recent concert in Astroworld, was that all external? And why did people die at Astroworld? Was it because people did what people do naturally and they just didn't take precautions? Or was there some other thing behind it?
It was satanic. It was satanic.
It was,
Satanic.
yeah.
If you look at the music and the atmosphere and the decorations they had and
Oh, again, that's
the
an
flames and
yeah.
it was, oh.
That's an external influence, right?
Yeah.
But what actually killed people?
That
There were
makes
some
it mob
people-
action.
There were
Too
mob.
many people.
There were people that were pushing, they were doing things. Okay, they were taking action as well. So all of these ideas were presented during the 60s through the 90s. Some of that is kind of lost its edge in the next millennium. And then there's another one. This actually started in the 19th century, where people felt like they could cure diseases by getting back to nature and removing the ills of society. And there's actually a couple of movies about that. Road to Wellville, and I believe that was anyway, that was a very funny movie. It was really about people that went to this beautiful resort to get into sunlight and to nature and to depend on in some cases they depend on the lack of technology, and in other cases it was ironic because we do depend on technology for health as well. But that technology was supposed to reinforce the natural man, you know. And as I mentioned, there's sexual liberation, there's a nature as God, spirituality, you know, where we can pick and choose things from Hindu religions and from other kinds of world religions. Basically make a smorgasbord of ways that we can get in touch with God by what we do, where we're at, how we perceive things, basically communing with nature. So this started in the Enlightenment. They basically dismissed the idea of sin. And the assumption was that humans are intrinsically good. How many of you have had an argument with a coworker or a discussion with a coworker about whether humans are intrinsically good or not? It's very interesting to ask someone, do you think humans are basically good? And ask other Christians what they think. Are we born good? And it's the way we're raised or something outside that's going to mess things up. They believed that under the right social conditions, their good nature would emerge. And to create an ideal society, we need to create a better environment. Let's re-engineer education. Let's re-engineer economics. Let's create new social structures. Let's fix what's broken with what influences people. And one of the champions of this idea was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he was a Swiss-born philosopher.
The human condition is that we sin within us. We sin because we are sinners. We aren't sinners because we sin. Crucial distinction. Because basically secular naturalism says, and this began with a colorful Swiss-born philosopher by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said, man is born good, and the Romanticism developed from that. Man is born free and everywhere is in chains, Rousseau said.
Rousseau was the great originator of these ideas, and we should understand his thinking better.
And we can break his thought down with our three-part grid, creation, fall, redemption. What did Rousseau teach about creation? Well, he rejected the biblical notion that God created the world, and instead of the Garden of Eden, he proposed something he called the state of nature. So the state of nature is a pre-social, pre-political state where human beings are in their ideal state. Just like in Christianity, the Garden of Eden was the ideal state. And we look back to the way God created us to figure out how we should live today. So Rousseau said, well, in the state of nature, man is good. Man is morally innocent. This was a dramatically novel notion in his day. No one in any other culture at any other time had ever denied that human beings are basically flawed, that there's a deep moral problem. Even non-Christian cultures have always recognized that. But Rousseau said no, in the state of nature, human nature is essentially good. So that was his approach to creation. What about the fall? For Rousseau, it was the rise of civilization. It was the rise of families and cultures and social institutions and church and tradition and custom. And everything that comes with civilization is what made people corrupt. For Rousseau, redemption was the state. The state was the liberator. And this, too, was a novel idea. No one had ever said this before. But for Rousseau, if the problem comes with the rise of social institutions, like the family and the church and the class and the clan, then the state was the liberator because the state would destroy those social bonds and those social ties.
Now, if that is true, if that's true, if people are basically corrupted only by the structures around them, then how do we get rid of sin and evil? Fix the structures. Fix the structures merely means that we can become like God. We become utopians. We can create a perfect society.
If you deny the fact that there is sin and real evil and real moral responsibility, you'll come up with a utopian view that human nature is basically good and we can create a good society, an ideal society. And the vast majority of the utopian ideologies of the 20th century have been based on that premise.
We've come to believe in the 20th century that great powerful structures can save us. And that's all part of the great utopian myth. If you deny that individuals are fallen, then you have to believe that they're basically good. And if they're basically good, the things that go wrong in society are because society isn't functioning correctly. So we can tinker with the machinery of society. And the utopian believes that we can create paradise on earth by just getting the structures of society right. What we saw that happen in the 20th century was that it fueled the totalitarian impulse because leaders believed if they had power, they could solve the problems of the people. They could deliver them from economic oppression, Marxism. All the isms of the 20th century that have led to oppression of people, that have led to the Gulag, that have led to the Holocaust, have come from this utopian notion.
I apologize, that was an 18-year-old VHS tape. Where I pulled that from.
Gotta fix the tracking.
Yeah.
That's right. That was really good then.
I think it was because I left it in that spot for a long time.
So you use Betamax?
I used to play it a lot. Yeah, you should have got Betamax. So what's the Enlightenment view of evil?
I have a question.
Yes.
On that last video we just saw, I was having a little trouble figuring out, one was a Christian and one was a philosopher, or?
No.
Or
Rousseau,
I couldn't
yes.
hear real well, but
Rousseau was a philosopher.
he was a philosopher.
Right, and we talked about Rousseau being the one that introduced this idea of man being basically born good.
Yes.
And that contrasted with the Christian idea.
So she was on the Christian perspective.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, Nancy Pearcey and Chuck Wilson were the co-authors of this book.
Oh, okay.
I think she still teaches actually here at New School.
Okay. Well, it's really sad that when you start listening to the philosophy of the man, the scriptures talk about, to stay away from the philosophy of man. I mean, we could come up with all kinds of reasons for everything, And it's really sad if you don't have the scriptures.
Right. The idea here is that not only do you need the scriptures, but you also need to be of the world I mean, in the world, but not of the world.
Exactly.
And being in the world helps you to be aware of, through your worldview radar, where these people are coming from. And like Paul, you can, once you realize what perspective they have on this problem or this issue of evil, you can engage them in a dialogue that's constructive, and hopefully through logic, through heart, you can point them to God's solution, which really works.
Yeah, it's really good to, like the scripture says, be ready to give an answer.
Yeah, 1
To
Peter
know what you
3:15.
believe, yes, but know what you believe, and also know what they believe, but not so much be convinced of what they believe. But to know so you can carry on an intelligent conversation.
Right. And some of us do need to be convinced occasionally
Yes.
that our
Well,
belief is
even
true.
In different areas of the scripture, yeah, we'll explain that to you here. Yeah. It's kind of like Republicans and Democrats.
If we would just talk to each other.
Yeah.
If you want to understand them, you have to know what they really, why they vote what they
I'm
vote.
hoping to get into that in the
Sorry, I
final
don't mean to
lesson.
interrupt.
So their worldview grid, creation were originally innocent. The fall is due to some outside corrupting influence. And the solution is to just eliminate that corrupting influence. There's a myth called scientism. It's about how science and technology will give us all the tools. Probably most of you all aren't susceptible to that one, but I am, or I was, particularly as a kid. If we only knew enough or evolved far enough, we could save ourselves. This was my favorite book of all time when I was a kid. It's called Against the Fall of Night. Probably nobody's ever heard of it unless you're a hardcore science fiction fan. It was written by Arthur Clarke, the author of 2001: A Space Odyssey. And it was this great, epic story about a young man who figured out who he was by, basically, it takes place 1 billion years in the future. And he finally figures out that man has evolved to the point where he has become a pure mind, a perfect intelligence, and basically he has evolved into God. And God has ruled the universe. But at the same time, the same experiments, evolutionary experiments that gave rise to this God, also gave rise to a mind that was completely evil, Satan. And so that both God and Satan were created by man by accident. It's a really interesting story. But there's lots of worldview things in there that just would set your alarm off now. You know, all your worldview antibodies would start acting out.
So did he ever come to the knowledge of Christ?
I don't think so. No, he
So that
died.
would be a book, if you were non-Christian, you can see how people are led into these
Oh, absolutely.
philosophies. If you're just reading stuff like that.
And of course, my favorite movie from the last century was Contact. And you all have seen that movie. That's full of worldview issues. And I've played scenes from that on this a lot. There's lots of discussion about God and all that. And of course, it was written by Carl Sagan, he also had a particular naturalistic or materialistic worldview, full of these issues. Great movie for discussion. So this idea of we can save ourselves, combined with that we're basically good, but also combined with the idea of this endless universal progress. That was something that Charles Darwin started with. And that came from a guy named Friedrich George Hegel. He was also a 19th century philosopher. And up until that time, everybody had believed in a ladder of progress. And he basically changed it to a moving escalator. And one of the reasons I brought this book is I wanted to read you something about that. Along with the denial of sin, the idea of inevitable progress has fueled the great utopian movements that we traced into the previous section. This idea first took hold through the work of 19th century German philosopher Georg Friedrich Hegel. At that time, the world had been pictured as a static ladder of life. Everything had its niche on a rung on this great ladder, from rocks to plants to animals to humans to angels to God himself. But Hegel did something entirely new, something really breathtaking. He tilted the ladder of life on its side so that instead of being a list of all the things that exist in the world at any one time, it became a series of stages through which the world passes during the course of history. Thus, the ladder was transformed into a dynamic series of steps. Everything moves from one rung to the next in an endless progress towards perfection. And he goes on to say how that's affected us today. How many of you know the Maslow's hierarchy of needs? You know, basic stuff that we hear all the time. And all of that arises from this worldview. And that doesn't necessarily mean that anything is wrong with that. It just means that if you understand the worldview that this is coming about, it starts to inform you about what steps you can take when you're making progress through your life. And he also introduced actually these metaphysical notions, like there was a world spirit and that we were kind of growing to become better and better. You probably would have been surprised to watch TV nowadays.
Or TikTok.
Yeah, or TikTok. Although TikTok is really funny, I do have to admit.
If you get rid of the Christian notion of redemption, the human heart is such that it will look for salvation somewhere else. And in Western history, the most attempts to try to find a new form of salvation is what we group under the escalator fallacy. In other words, if instead of heaven coming at the end of time and being an act of God breaking into human history, heaven becomes something that we can create here on earth. If we can just advance far enough, that's where the escalator image comes in. If we can go up through social or biological evolution, we can evolve to a higher level, create a new society, create a new man, create a new men and women.
So you heard Chuck Colson mention utopia. We could recreate the utopias. And this is where this topic hit home for me. And I'll explain in a couple of slides here. So the idea of utopia is if I have enough power, I can use it to liberate human goodness. I can fix things if I have the power to change all of these external influences and create an ideal society. Sir Thomas More wrote this book called Utopia in 1516. 400 or something years ago, almost 500 years ago. 500 years ago. And it's funny, when I first said this, it was 400 something. Now it's over 500. And it had this idea of a perfect world. What would that be like? And do we have a chance of making it?
So you wonder if Martin Luther got all that thing at some point.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah. So where did this idea of utopia come from? There you go. It's been around for a long time. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Lest we be scattered abroad over the whole face of the earth. Let's concentrate that human goodness in one spot. And let's be able to reach up to heaven. Well, God spotted that for what it was way back. All right. And we know what he thinks about that. But most of the world still buys that idea. Utopians, again, have substituted every imaginable cause as a sort of corruption. Colson said in his book, either the government doesn't have enough power, or teachers provide the wrong education, or the church teaches bad doctrine, or the economic system is oppressive, or suffering is deceiving them, or they have their authority limited, or temptation leads them astray, or you name it. That's what's broken. And this is where it hits home. When I was in school, we studied all the work of the great architects. Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright. And Le Corbusier created this on-paper sketch of a thing he called the radiant city. His idea was that, you know, the reason our slums are so bad and our our cities are so awful is because they don't have enough light, they don't have enough space, they don't have enough trees. And he showed how this radiant city would look if we took basically everybody who was spread out among the, the slums and stacked them into these beautiful high-rise towers. And created all of this open space with plazas where children could play. And planted all these trees where everything was green. It was an architectural response to the problem of cities decaying. And Frank Lloyd Wright also was kind of involved in that at the time. He actually created a mile-high skyscraper, sort of a utopian idea of something that made a statement. And it was right at the limits of our technology. And how much better society would be with something like this. Early 20th century architects visualized cities and societies, and it had a big influence on what people did in my business. Here's his book, Corbusier's Sun, Space, and Greenery. And so these ideas caught on with a particular architect, and he created a dream of a perfect community for the city of St. Louis. That architect's name was Minoru Yamasaki.
Was he Italian?
And he was actually on the cover of Time magazine for all of the great work that he did. And this is a picture of a development he did for the city of St. Louis and some of his sketches for what it would look like to live in that area of the building. And all these people with their children and playing and all of this. And I want to play you first I'm going to play you a video about Corbusier, about how he envisioned all of this. And then a promotion video for this development in St. Louis that Yamasaki did that kind of goes down the same road.
In 1953, it was the mayor of Firminy who commissioned the housing development. Even during those days, the architect was known for his avant-garde style.
The fundamental paradigm of this architectural and social revolution can be summed up by three ideas: the sun, space, and trees.
And it was amidst these trees that Le Corbusier created his utopia, with the nursery some 50 meters above the ground.
These developments are run by the St. Louis Housing Authority. This is a far cry from the crowded, collapsing tenements that many of these people have known. Here in bright new buildings with spacious grounds, they can live.
It was a very beautiful place, like a big hotel resort, I'd say.
It was like an oasis in the desert. All this newness. I never thought I would live in that kind of a surrounding.
Okay, it was a utopia that was actually put in real life. And the Title I Housing Act funded the construction of this project in the mid-50s. And it was the greatest work of this architect today. And it was lauded as such in all the architectural magazines before I was born. When I was about 20 years old, I got a job with the Utah Housing Authority, where I learned about this project. And it absolutely shocked me what happened to it. So the next video is about this.
Well, one day we woke up and it was all gone.
We pulled up with the moving van. I knew at that point that it was hell on earth.
Pruitt-Igoe looks like a battleground. Vandalism and neglect have left fear among the remaining occupants.
In the middle 50s, St. Louis thought it had solved its low-cost housing need, but instead a monster was created.
And so this is a modern, contemporary attempt to create utopia by fixing what's broken. And there were a lot of reasons that Pruitt-Igoe ended up being dynamited. Some of it was that the city didn't budget for maintenance. Some of it was design flaw. You know, there's a lady that wrote a whole book called Defensible Space, that when you're living in a high-rise building, and this is what they told us at the time, was that people felt like they had to have their own space that they could defend. And the more public space you had, the less chance anybody would step out because of human nature and maintain that. And then the city and the federal government didn't anticipate through the rents that they would keep declining as people got disgusted with living conditions and just moved out. And so those were the outside influences that happened, but also combined with the inside influences. Keep in mind, this is a housing development for poor people. One of the things I learned that also surprised me in 1976 and 77 was that high-rises worked great for elderly people. They didn't work for families. And it has to do a lot with family dynamics. It has to do with the nature of human beings as well. What kinds of...
When I was in building construction, which was in the School of Architecture, and we were studying these guys. I can't remember who all the guys were doing these really tall buildings. And one of these people, they built some stuff in Arizona. And anyway, this guy was coming. He was lecturing to us. And I was standing next to one of my professors. I go, you know, the whole idea was to have minimal living space, and then
lots of
everything.
space.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I was like, what would that do to the family? You know?
Right, right.
You know, and break down. And then what's happening here reminds me of what, like in the book, When Helping Hurts, it talks about how we throw money away and cause bigger problems. And I always had to train a lot on that before we went to our trips, because we were always going to super poor places. And it was talking about how, like after the World Wars, how we helped rebuild Germany and Japan. It's like, wow, look what happened. This was great. So it was like, okay, let's go do this to India. Because there's a fundamental problem that has to be dealt with first.
Right. And you can see why it worked in Japan. That's part of their society, is teamwork and helping each other and seeing common property as something that is still something that is worth maintaining.
Well, even the idea that, you know, let's say if you have a family member that was always an alcoholic and all this stuff, you go give him money, you're just exacerbating the problem. But if you have a family member that he was always responsible with money and something bad happened, yeah, you can give that person money, because their problem is not that fundamental relationship with money and responsibility and stuff. But if you give it where there's irresponsibility, the book teaches you never give somebody money unless they're going to die. You never throw money at them unless they agree to go through a process of development, you know, rehabilitation.
Inside as well as outside.
Fixing that and teaching them what are your strengths and things like that. You don't just give people money. People on the curb, you don't give them money, never.
And what's the core of that? Recognizing human nature.
Your human nature, your relationship, a proper relationship with God, and all of this stuff.
So this architect, Yamasaki, it wasn't his last commission. You would think he was. He was still a well-respected architect. He built all this stuff. What you're seeing here is a project that he built in Seattle. So he had a new project, and he said that this project will become the living symbol of man's dedication to world peace. He got this project later, and it's beyond, this is his words, beyond the compelling need to make this a monument to world peace, it should, because of its importance, become a representation of man's belief in humanity, his need for individual dignity, and his belief in the cooperation of men. And through cooperation, his ability to find greatness. Doesn't that sound awesome, that a project could do all of that? Mm-hmm. And he made these remarks at the opening ceremonies in 1973 of this building. World Trade Center. So the suggestion is that utopian solutions are often bound to fail. It's if you don't recognize the fundamental problem of the fall at the core of any kind of solution. The one thing is, Hemingway recognized this. He was sort of an existentialist, and he basically decided that it was his ultimate autonomy to die. And that leads to nihilism, like we talked about last week. And this myth of naturalism also led Sigmund Freud to have his own famous physician-assisted suicide. So Christ knew the real answer. Hear and understand, it is not what enters into the mouth that defiles the man, but what proceeds out of his mouth, what comes from inside at the core of our being that defiles the man. Matthew 15:10. We sin because we're sinners, as Chuck Colson said. We don't sin because somebody made us. We don't sin because we're influenced. We don't sin because of the way we're brought up. We sin because we're basically born that way. We're by nature sinners. We inherited from Adam. We are a party in the fall. And the redemption through human progress fails because humans are fallible. Redemption through utopianism, Marxism, and similar philosophies fails, since the power to suppress evil is itself evil.
Yes.
Gave rise to totalitarianism, to authoritarianism, to fascism. You hear all of those, and those are valid concerns where somebody's trying to fix things from the outside. Sexual liberation fails because it doesn't address the source of what's wrong. The autonomy to choose fails because if there is no truth, there's no moral standard. Christianity works in the marketplace of ideas. It matches reality. It correctly identifies the source of evil. It recognizes the weakness of man. It relies on an absolute standard of morality, not one that's changeable or decidable by committee or by society. And the power to fix what's wrong lies in the source of ultimate goodness apart from mankind. Any questions?